Welcome, dear listeners, to the Drawing Room Detectives, where the gas lamps flicker, secrets linger in the fog, and the keen mind of Sherlock Holmes never rests. Tonight, we turn the pages of a most unusual case. It begins not with a crime nor a corpse, but with a book, washed ashore along the banks of the Thames, its pages long thought lost to fire. A book leads to a second, and a second to a pattern, one that only Mr. Holmes can decipher. This is the case of the drowned library. And before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoy timeless mysteries brought back to life, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a case. Chapter 1. The Book on the Riverbank. It was in the early spring of the year 1895, a season marked by relentless drizzle and a grey pall over the rooftops of London, that a case of singular peculiarity was first brought to our attention. At the time, my practice was quiet, and Holmes, though not engaged upon any matter of national urgency, had turned his restless intellect to a study of early Mesopotamian seals, which he pursued with a degree of zeal that rendered our sitting room nearly uninhabitable for the presence of clay rubbings, chemical reagents, and pungent lacquers. We were seated one morning before the fire, he upon the floor surrounded by his paraphernalia, and I with the lancet upon my knee, when Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a card upon a small tray. "A Mr. Allard," she announced, "from Featherstone's bookshop in Pimlico." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Send him up, if you please." The gentleman who entered was slight and spectacled, with a scholar's stoop and fingers stained faintly with ink. He carried a satchel bound with string and wore an expression of mingled embarrassment and excitement. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Holmes," he began, "but I did not know where else to turn. It is no crime, I suppose, but it is most unusual." "Unusual is a calling card in this room," Holmes replied genially. "Pray be seated, Mr. Allard, and tell us what has brought you here." The man took a chair by the hearth and opened his satchel with care. From it he drew a single book, badly warped and discoloured by water. Its leather cover was mottled with mildew, and its spine had cracked away to reveal yellowed stitching. "I found this," he said, 2 days ago. "A boy brought it into the shop, claiming he had found it along the southern bank of the Thames near Battersea. I thought it no more than a curiosity until I examined it more closely." Holmes took the volume delicately and opened it. The pages, though sodden and stuck at the edges, bore the faded type of a theological treatise, Reflections upon the Early Church Fathers, printed in 1821. "There," said Allard, pointing to the margin. "Do you see it?" In the gutter of the page, running alongside a passage discussing the Gospel of Thomas, were a series of small markings, inked in a fine hand, symbols and slashes, not unlike the shorthand I had once seen used by clerks at the Admiralty. "Have you identified the script?" Holmes asked. "I have not. But what is most curious is this. I recognized the book from a catalogue printed many years ago. It was listed as part of the Pike collection, a private theological library thought lost in a fire. In 1872, the entire house was consumed. Nothing survived." Holmes had been silent, but now he stirred. "Yet here it is," he said softly. "A drowned book from a burnt library." Mr. Allard nodded. "And I have not told you the most remarkable part. Yesterday morning I was informed that another such book had been found, this time near Lambeth Pier. The water damage is the same, and the margin bears similar symbols." Holmes closed the volume and placed it gently upon the table. "Mr. Allard," he said, "I thank you for bringing this to me. You have not only presented me with a mystery, but one that smells faintly of the river and the fire, two elements not often combined." The bookseller blinked behind his spectacles. "Do you think it has meaning, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes stood and moved to the window, peering out at the rain-slicked street. "If it does," he said, "then someone is dredging the past not for sentiment but for purpose, and such men, I have found, often leave trails, if not in ink, then in intent." Watson closed the lancet with a soft snap. "What do you propose, Holmes?" Holmes turned from the window, his grey eyes alight. "We visit Pimlico, Watson, and then the river." Chapter 2, The Collector's Ledger. It was a murky Thursday morning when Holmes and I made our way to Featherstone's bookshop, a narrow, bow-fronted establishment tucked between a tobacconist and a shuttered milliner on a side street in Pimlico. The sign above the door bore gilt letters dulled by time, and the windows were crowded with old folios, faded engravings, and the occasional bust of Cicero or Horace, now chipped and green with age. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and dust, a perfume known only to those who traffic in forgotten knowledge. Mr. Allard greeted us with nervous enthusiasm and led Holmes directly to a counter in the rear, where the first of the recovered volumes lay open upon a velvet cloth. "As I mentioned," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "this is the book brought in by the Battersea boy. I have made no effort to clean or alter it." Holmes drew a thin glove from his pocket and turned the pages with great delicacy. He paused at the margin markings, which, though faint, had not run despite the water damage. "Interesting," he murmured. "These are not letters, nor are they shorthand in the conventional sense. Observe, Watson, the consistency of spacing, and here this sequence repeats on page 47 in the same formation." I bent to examine them. "Could it be a code?" "Without doubt," Holmes replied. "But a code drawn not from language, I think, but from position. These are directional indicators. This set of symbols, note the 3 parallel lines and the small chevron, corresponds precisely with a cartographer's notation for a bend in a watercourse. You believe it to be a map? I believe it to be fragments of one." Allard, who had been listening attentively, now produced a slim ledger from beneath the counter. "I have here a catalogue of the Pike collection," he said. "It was published privately in 1869, and only a few copies are known to exist. I acquired this one from an estate auction in Hampstead last year." Holmes received the volume eagerly and leafed through the brittle pages until he found the listing for the book in question, Reflections upon the Early Church Fathers, shelved once in Section G, Cabinet the 3. "According to the note here," said Allard, tapping the margin, "this copy was annotated in Reverend Pike's own hand." Holmes's face darkened slightly, though with interest, not concern. "Then either these markings are Pike's, or someone has imitated his hand to add new meaning to a defunct library. Neither explanation bodes ordinary intent." Before we could speak further, the door chime tinkled behind us, and a lad entered the shop, dripping from the shoulders and clutching something wrapped in brown paper. "Are you the bookman?" he asked Allard. "I am," said the bookseller, stepping forward. The boy set the package on the counter and peeled back the damp wrapping. Within was another book, similarly aged and water-stained. Its spine had gone entirely, and several pages were warped beyond recognition. But as Holmes turned it over, a familiar set of marginal markings presented themselves, this time in red ink, faded but intact. "Where did you find this?" Holmes asked the boy, his voice low. "Lambeth Pier, sir. Caught on the edge of a mooring post." Holmes nodded to Allard, who handed the boy a shilling and ushered him out with a kind word. Then, turning back to the volume, he placed both books side by side and studied them under the gaslight. "The annotations here follow a new sequence," he said. "But when overlaid with the former, a pattern begins to emerge. These are not arbitrary. Someone is placing these books along the river for discovery, and not by accident." "To be found by whom?" I asked. Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming. That, my dear Watson, is the question. If these books were merely lost, they would have perished together. But they are appearing one by one in sequence and with deliberate care. That implies not carelessness, but communication. He turned to Allard. Should another arrive, Mr. Allard, you will telegraph me at once. In the meantime, Watson and I shall pay a visit to the records office of the London Fire Brigade. And what, I asked as we stepped back into the fog, do you hope to learn there? The truth about a fire that may have burned less completely than history would have us believe. Chapter 3. A Library in Ashes. It was an hour past 10 the following morning when Holmes and I took hansom to the British Library reading room, then situated within the great dome of the British Museum. The day was bleak and foggy, as so many are in London's early spring, and Holmes, though outwardly serene, displayed the unmistakable signs of inward stimulation. His fingers twitched restlessly at his lapels, and more than once he murmured fragments of phrases, burned but not buried, and ecclesiastical reticence, as though teasing out some inner logic. Upon our arrival we were greeted with the courteous formality typical of that great institution, and Holmes, producing one of his personal cards, requested access to the archives pertaining to Reverend Algernon Pike and the fire at Roseheath House in Hampstead, dated to the year 1872. The assistant librarian, a serious young man with pale hair and ink-stained cuffs, raised an eyebrow at the name. Pike, sir? Curious you should ask. I have only just this week been cataloguing an index of non-circulating theological holdings, and his name appeared in a footnote regarding prescribed literature. Holmes's interest visibly quickened. Prescribed, you say? The librarian nodded. There was, it seems, a quiet ecclesiastical ruling in the early part of the century regarding Reverend Pike's views. Nothing official, you understand, but certain texts from his collection were marked for special handling and removed from public access following the destruction of his estate. May we see that index? The young man disappeared and returned some minutes later with a thick, cloth-bound ledger, which he opened to a carefully marked page. Holmes examined the list of titles, many of them unfamiliar, even to my well-read eye: the Gospel of Mary, the writings of Pelagius, and a number of Latin tracts whose titles had been partially redacted with ink. These, Holmes remarked, are not merely rare. They are dangerous to orthodoxy. I leaned closer. You believe Pike was a heretic? Perhaps not in his own eyes, Holmes replied, but to the Church and the institutions of the day, such material would have been regarded as seditious. What is intriguing is that following the fire, every copy of Pike's catalogue and correspondence appears to have been sealed or destroyed. Officially? I asked. Not quite. Note this entry, he said, tapping a date in the margin. The listing refers to a record of the Pike fire held by the London Fire Brigade, but a note has been appended here, in another hand, record withdrawn, per request of C of E, June 1873. That would be the Church of England. I blinked. They intervened in a fire investigation. Or more accurately, said Holmes, they intervened in what survived the fire. I believe Reverend Pike's house did indeed burn, but not so thoroughly as the record would suggest, and more to the point, someone ensured that what survived would be rendered inaccessible. We spent the remainder of the hour combing through related correspondence and catalogue entries. Much had been withdrawn or lost to consolidation, but Holmes took careful notes and copied, in his fine angular script, 3 entries that referred to a series of folios labelled Speculum Veritatis, a compendium of theological disputes from the 4th to the 6th centuries, said to have included early Gnostic texts. As we departed into the cold mist of Great Russell Street, Holmes drew his coat tighter and hailed a cab with uncommon haste. "Where now?" I asked, settling beside him. "To Lambeth Palace," he said. "If the church buried Pike's memory, They did so in shadow, but even shadows leave impressions, Watson, and I intend to lift the cloth. Chapter 4. Inquiries at the Diocesan Archives. Lambeth Palace, though not unfamiliar to me in my student days, had always seemed to me more a place of solemn tradition than secrecy. Its battlemented towers, red brick walls, and ancient chapel stood in austere contrast to the industrious tide of the Thames just beyond its gates. Yet, as Holmes and I crossed the courtyard under a sullen sky, I could not help but feel we entered a citadel less of faith than of guarded knowledge. Our request, presented in writing and signed with Holmes's precise copperplate, had been submitted the previous day and granted under the strictest conditions. We were to be admitted to the diocesan reference room for no more than 1 hour, and only under supervision. The Reverend Mr. Altham, an Archdeacon's secretary of notably dry manner, greeted us with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You are aware," he said, ushering us through a narrow corridor lined with portraits of prelates, "that the records you seek are not generally open to the public." "I am not the public," Holmes replied mildly, "and we seek only the truth behind a matter long thought extinguished." The reference room itself was a vaulted chamber, its stone walls thick with the smell of wax and parchment. Glass-fronted cases lined the room, and in the centre stood a long table where, under the watchful eye of Mr. Altham, 2 folios had been set out for our review. "These are the only remaining documents directly referencing Reverend Algernon Pike," he said. "The rest were lost in the incident at Roseheath House." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes flickered keenly as he examined the documents. The first was a letter dated 4th of March, 1871, written from Pike to the Bishop of Gloucester, in which he discussed recent discoveries that suggest the canonical record may be incomplete. The letter hinted at an intention to publish a tract based on those discoveries, though it was couched in the guarded language of theological discourse. The second was of greater interest still, a memorandum from the Church's Ecclesiastical Censorship Committee, bearing the seal of the Archbishop's office and marked confidential. Holmes read it aloud in a low voice. "The Reverend Pike's collection, while scholarly, contains material deemed contrary to established doctrine and potentially inflammatory to the faithful. It is recommended that in the event of Pike's death or removal, his private holdings be secured and all associated publications suppressed in cooperation with the Home Office." "Remarkable," I murmured. "It appears the Church feared his work might cause unrest." "Not unrest, Watson," said Holmes quietly. "Re-evaluation. There is nothing institutions dread more than the revision of their own foundations." He turned to Mr. Altham. "And was Pike removed?" The secretary's expression grew stiff. "There was no formal action taken against him, Mr. Holmes. He died in the fire, along with his household." Holmes closed the folio with care. "Yet no body was ever recovered." Mr. Altham hesitated. "That is true, but the nature of the fire made identification impossible. It was deemed a matter closed." "Convenient," Holmes said, and rose. "I thank you for your courtesy. I believe we have seen all we need for now." As we exited into the chill air, the chimes of St. Mary's rang out across the river. Holmes paused at the gate and drew out his pocketbook, jotting down a note. "You suspect Pike may have survived?" I asked. "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Or perhaps someone else survived for him. The more I learn, the more I am convinced that those books are not flotsam, but messages sent from a hand that remembers too well the fire and what it was meant to silence." Chapter 5. A Man in Grey Wool. It was some days after our visit to Lambeth that I first became aware of the presence of the man in grey. The afternoon had been unusually mild for March, and Holmes, having retired from an unproductive morning of chemical experiment, had fallen into one of those long silences which I had come to recognize as fertile ground for mental calculation. I had taken my place at the sitting-room window of 221B, nursing a cup of tea and allowing my thoughts to drift when a slight motion across the street drew my attention. There, half obscured by a hackney carriage and pretending to read a newspaper against the railings of the park, stood a man of medium build, clad in a grey woolen coat and bowler. Though his face was angled down, it was not the attitude of leisure, but of effortful concealment. He stood there motionless for nearly 10 minutes, shifting only once when a pair of children ran past him on the pavement. "Holmes," I said, without taking my eyes from the glass, "we appear to have gained a watcher." He joined me at the window in an instant, his long fingers parting the curtain just enough to afford a clear view. "Interesting," he murmured. "You see how his coat sleeve is worn at the cuff? A desk man, perhaps, not a labourer. But his boots are suited for walking, and his stance, narrow, cautious, suggests nervous purpose, not random loitering." As we observed, the man folded his paper, glanced quickly left and right, and proceeded northward at a brisk but measured pace. "Come, Watson," Holmes said abruptly, "fetch your hat." We descended quickly to the street and followed at a distance, Holmes adjusting our pace to keep just behind and out of view. The man moved with the confidence of one who knew the city well, cutting across side streets and narrow alleys until we reached the embankment near Blackfriars, where the fog clung low and the lamps cast golden circles in the mist. It was there that our quarry paused. He turned slightly, perhaps sensing pursuit, then stepped down a side stair toward the river's edge. Holmes hastened, and I kept close behind, but when we reached the foot of the stair, the man had vanished. "Confound it," I muttered. "He must have slipped onto one of those moored barges." Holmes studied the fog-bound stretch of water, his gaze keen and expression unreadable. "No splash," he said. "No boat pushed off, no figure running. He knew precisely where he was going." We walked a little further along the embankment, but the man was gone. Holmes crouched near the edge of the quay and examined the stone. "Here," he said, pointing. "A scuff mark in the algae. Someone slid along the ledge. There, too, a finger-sized depression on the railing. He waited here. He wanted to be seen." "To what end?" "To judge whether we are pursuing or receiving," Holmes replied. "And I believe we are the latter." I looked at him, puzzled. "The books?" he said. "They are not meant to be hidden forever, Watson. They are being placed like offerings in a ritual. Our watcher is not guarding them, but guiding them, making certain they are found and by the right hands." We returned to Baker Street in silence, each lost in our own thought. As we reached our door, Holmes paused on the threshold and turned to me. "There is something in these volumes," he said, "some truth or relic that has waited too long beneath ash and water. And now, it seems, time itself conspires to raise it." Chapter 6. The Map in the Margins. In the weeks that followed the appearance of the second river book, our lodgings in Baker Street took on the aspect of a cartographer's den. Holmes, in one of his more fevered bouts of cerebral application, had transformed the sitting-room into a chaos of maps, measuring compasses, rulers, and India ink. The floor was littered with sketches and transparencies, some drawn on vellum, others traced onto fine tissue paper, and layered over one another with the aid of pins and brass tacks. "Observe, Watson," he said one morning, as I returned from my rounds and nearly tripped over a roll of parchment. "The symbols, though varied, maintain a consistent logic of orientation. This one," he pointed to a squiggled ink mark in the margin of the Lambeth volume, "is a stylized rendering of the temple steps, while this," he shifted to the Battersea copy, "is clearly a curve of the river opposite Millbank." "You mean to say these are not mere annotations, but coordinates?" "Precisely. Whoever inscribed these pages, whether Pike himself or another, is directing the reader by means of a spatial cipher. It is topographic in nature, not linguistic. He moved swiftly across the room to a wall where he had affixed a large map of the Thames, marked in red and blue with Holmes's customary precision. I have now identified 6 such locations. When connected, he drew a line between the points, they form a rough semicircle along the southern embankment. But the centre of gravity, the fulcrum upon which all these clues appear to turn, lies here. He tapped the map just below the word Southwark. An old quay, he added, now disused and half fallen into the river. It was once part of a fishmonger's storehouse, later absorbed into the expansion of the wharf yards. Forgotten now and seldom visited, save by rats and river fog. Do you propose to search it? Holmes had already donned his coat. Indeed, the tide will be at its lowest just past midnight. Bring your revolver, Watson, and a pair of oilskin boots. I suspect we may require both. That night was cold, and the moon rode high and misty above the river's sluggish swell. We made our way through narrow alleys and rotting boards until we reached the crumbling edge of the Southwark quay. Holmes carried a lantern in one hand and a small pry-bar in the other. He moved with the assured tread of a man not merely seeking, but expecting. "There," he said, crouching low. A weather-stained iron ring protruded from the edge of the quay, half submerged and crusted with barnacles. Beneath it, almost invisible beneath the lapping waterline, was a stone lip with a recessed groove. Together we pulled, and with a groan of rust and stone, a section of the quay shifted outward, revealing a narrow opening just above the high water mark. A stagnant gust issued from the blackness beyond, rich with the scent of decay, oil, and old timbers. Holmes held the lantern aloft. The passage beyond sloped downward at a gentle incline, its walls lined in aged brick, slick with condensation. Iron bolts, long corroded, framed the archway, suggesting that at one time the passage could have been sealed from within. "This was no accident," Holmes said softly. "It is an entrance, hidden, preserved, and placed deliberately below the water's gaze." I stepped forward, revolver drawn. Holmes smiled faintly. "Ever the soldier, Watson?" "Ever the realist," I replied. He crouched at the threshold and examined the stone floor. "Foot traffic, old but present. Someone has been here, more than once, and not long ago." He stood and turned to me, the flickering light throwing his aquiline features into sharp relief. "The drowned library," he said, "has not yet fully sunk." Chapter 7, A Memory Recovered. It is one of Holmes's enduring principles that while records may vanish and letters may be forged or destroyed, the human memory, though imperfect, often contains truths that paper cannot preserve. Thus, when a further search of church registries and fire brigade reports yielded little but redacted entries and missing folios, he resolved to turn to those who had lived through the events themselves. By some quiet inquiry through a network of former clients, Holmes located a man named Dunn, once an engine driver in the London Fire Brigade, now retired, and living modestly in a brick terrace near Stepney Green. He had been among the first to respond to the blaze at Roseheath House, where Reverend Pike's residence had stood. We found Mr. Dunn in his garden pruning a row of struggling cabbages. His beard was white and coarse, his eyes watery, but still sharp beneath thick brows. He greeted us with cautious hospitality and a mistrust that Holmes, through respectful tone and gentle promptings, soon dissolved. "You'll forgive me," he said at last, once we were seated in his small parlour. "But most folk who come asking about that fire are scribblers or clergymen. Never thought I'd see a detective wanting to know." Holmes steepled his fingers. "I am not interested in gossip, Mr. Dunn, only in the facts, particularly in what was seen and what was said by those who stood closest to the blaze. Dunn rubbed a gnarled hand across his brow. "It were a strange one, that fire," he said slowly. "Middle of the night, thick smoke, the whole place lit like a bloody furnace. But it weren't the flames that stuck with me. It was what came after." "Go on," said Holmes gently. We'd managed to get a hose to the south wing, too late for much, mind you, and the roof was already gone. That was when I saw a figure crawling out from the far side of the ruins. Not the Reverend, no. This was a young man, thin and pale, clothes black with soot. Looked like he'd come up from a grave. Did he speak? Only his name, Hartwell, Mr. Elias Hartwell. Said he worked for Reverend Pike, kept the catalogue and sorted the manuscripts. "Was he injured?" I asked. "No worse than smoke and some burns to the hands, but before I could see to him properly 2 gentlemen arrived, black coats, tall hats, no badges but plenty of authority. They said he was under protection of the Home Office and took him away in their carriage. Never saw him again." Holmes's expression did not change, but I could see his mind turning behind those pale eyes. "Did they leave a name?" he asked. "Not one. But they had the look of men who don't take questions." "And you told no one?" Dunn shrugged. "Who'd listen? The Reverend was declared dead, and that was the end of it." Holmes rose and offered the old man his hand. "Mr. Dunn, I am deeply obliged to you. You have given us a thread long buried." As we left the house and turned down the fog-blurred lane, Holmes spoke softly. "Elias Hartwell, archivist, survived the fire. Removed by agents with no official record. And now, perhaps, the hand behind these drifting books." "Do you believe he still lives?" I asked. "If he does, he's an old man now," said Holmes. "But even the dying have motives, especially when they seek to cleanse the conscience rather than the record." He hailed a cab and turned to me with a rare glint of satisfaction. "Back to Baker Street, Watson. I believe it is time we laid a trap for a librarian." Chapter 8. The Archivist's Confession. It was on a sombre afternoon in early April, the sky a dull leaden grey, and the air heavy with the promise of rain, that Holmes and I journeyed to a modest convalescent home on the outskirts of Richmond. The establishment, Ivyhurst House, stood in quiet seclusion amidst a grove of beeches, its windows latticed and its grounds well tended, though not ostentatious. It was the sort of place one might retire to with dignity, but with few illusions of recovery. Holmes had said little during the cab ride, save for a few sparse remarks regarding the institution's reputation and the discreet nature of its admissions. It was clear from his bearing that he was confident in what we would find, and that we had reached the final stretch of a long-concealed truth. We were received by a matronly nurse in starched linen, who, upon hearing the name Elias Hartwell, glanced nervously toward the end of the corridor. "He is very weak," she said. "The doctors say he has only days, perhaps less." Holmes inclined his head. "We shall not stay long." She led us down a dim hallway lined with oil portraits and closed doors. At the far end, we were shown into a small, sunlit room where a thin figure lay beneath a patchwork quilt propped against a bank of pillows. His skin was pallid, and his cheeks had the hollowness of approaching death, but his eyes, when they opened to regard us, retained a curious sharpness. "You are not clergymen," he said in a dry whisper, "nor physicians. So what brings you, gentlemen?" Holmes stepped forward and removed his gloves. "Mr. Hartwell, my name is Sherlock Holmes. I believe you have been sending books into the Thames." At this, a flicker of recognition passed over the man's face, followed by a faint smile. "Then they were found," he said. "Good. I had hoped as much." Holmes drew a chair beside the bed. "We have traced the books, the markings, and even the concealed vault beneath the quay. What we have not yet found is your reason." Hartwell sighed, and the effort seemed to steal some of the colour from his already wan features. "In my youth," he said, "I served as cataloguer to Reverend Algernon Pike, a good man, stern, scholarly, but good. He had gathered a private library that few ever saw, books that had survived inquisitions, bannings, and worse. He believed that the truth should not be kept under lock and key, no matter how unsettling." "And the church disagreed," I said gently. "They did more than disagree," Hartwell rasped. "They ordered the seizure of the most damning volumes, those that questioned the Gospels, that spoke of rival apostles, of doctrines abandoned and erased. Pike resisted, of course, and then came the fire." Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the old man. "You were there." "I was," Hartwell nodded. "I escaped through the cellars with as many books as I could carry, while Pike stayed behind to delay them. I believe he perished in the blaze, though I never saw him fall. I made my way to the river and concealed the texts beneath the floor of a derelict boathouse where later I constructed a vault of brick and iron. It is not elegant, but it has kept the books dry for over 2 decades. "And the annotations?" Holmes asked. "The coded maps?" Hartwell gave a faint chuckle, which ended in a cough. "I could not bear the idea that they would die with me, but I could not simply deliver them either. Too dangerous, too many eyes, so I devised a trail for the right sort of mind to follow, one who could find, understand, and perhaps protect them. You, Mr. Holmes." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a small clock upon the mantel. "And now," Hartwell whispered, "I have little left to give, but if you follow the last map in the 3rd volume, which I released 2 nights ago, you will find the key. The vault lies beneath the 5th bollard at Quay. Lift the stone slab, and all will be revealed." Holmes reached forward and laid a hand gently upon the man's arm. "You have done what few men have, Mr. Hartwell. You have preserved a truth at great personal cost." Hartwell smiled faintly. "I only wish I had done it sooner." He closed his eyes then, and we took our leave. As we stepped once more into the fresh air, the rain beginning to fall in fine sheets across the lawn, Holmes drew a long breath. "There is a kind of redemption in knowledge, Watson," he said. "Let us hope that what lies beneath that key is worthy of the sacrifice." Chapter 9. The Vault Beneath the Quay. The Thames was at its most reluctant ebb when we arrived at Quay just after 2 o'clock in the morning. Fog clung low to the water's edge, broken only by the rhythmic hiss of the river lapping against the moss-slick stones. Holmes had arranged for our passage by boat and brought with him a modest satchel of tools, chisels, rope, a crowbar, and a small lantern enclosed in green-tinted glass. The air was damp with river scent and the unmistakable hush that falls over London in its rarest hours. "According to Hartwell," Holmes murmured as we crouched along the quay's lip, "the 5th bollard from the edge hides a concealed stone. We must be precise, for the tide shall not remain our ally for long." I counted along the rusted mooring posts, pausing at the 5th, where a metal ring jutted from the stone, as if unused in many years. Holmes brushed away a film of algae with a gloved hand and examined the surface closely. Then, taking up his chisel, he inserted the blade into a thin seam I would not have noticed on my own. "With care," he said, more to himself than to me. A soft, cracking sound issued from beneath his hand. Slowly, with effort, Holmes lifted the slab free, revealing a shallow depression in the quay. Beneath it lay an iron ring attached to a hinged panel of stone, cleverly counterweighted. With a groan of ancient hinges and the aid of the crowbar, the false section gave way, revealing a dark passage descending beneath the waterline. "You were right," I said. "He buried them like treasure." Holmes nodded. "And now we must descend like thieves." We lit the lantern and made our way down a short flight of damp stone steps, the air growing close and rank with each footfall. The passage ended in a low, barrel-vaulted chamber, half submerged when the tide was high, but now dry enough to navigate. Set into the walls were wooden shelves and crates, every inch of them occupied by tightly wrapped bundles in oiled canvas and wax-sealed leather satchels. Holmes moved quickly, his hand skimming across the bindings. He selected one, unwrapped it, and held the brittle volume up to the lantern. "The Epistula Clementis ad Jacobum," he said, eyes gleaming. "A Gnostic epistle, suppressed at the Council of Constantinople. This one, the Acts of Thecla, believed apocryphal. And here, look at this, Watson, the Gospel of Judas, bound in Syrian vellum." I bent closer and saw that the script was in several languages, Greek, Latin, and one I could not identify. The pages crackled like parchment leaves, each one covered in cramped handwriting and marginal symbols. "These texts," Holmes said softly, "represent not heresy but history, the other side of doctrine, sealed away not by fire alone but by fear." We spent a silent hour cataloguing the titles, Holmes noting each in his black leather notebook. There were over 50 volumes, many bearing ecclesiastical seals, others clearly older than the earliest printed Bibles. All were preserved with extraordinary care. "How did he accomplish this alone?" I asked in wonder. "He did not," said Holmes. "I believe Hartwell had aid, perhaps from Pike before the fire, or perhaps from sympathizers within the church itself, men who feared too much knowledge but feared its total loss even more." At length, Holmes resealed the vault, camouflaging our entry point as it had been before. We stood once more upon the quay, the sky paling faintly with the first suggestion of dawn. "What will you do with the knowledge?" I asked. Holmes was silent for a moment. "Knowledge, Watson, is power, but only when placed in the right hands. I shall secure these volumes in trust, away from meddling authorities and profit-seekers. Let others debate their meaning in time. My task was only to find them." He turned toward the waiting boat. "And now let us return to Baker Street. We have navigated secrets long buried. Let the river rest and the city sleep again." Chapter 10. Agents in the Fog. It was not long after our return from Klamath Quay that the matter took on a more serious tone. Though Holmes had taken great care in concealing the recovered manuscripts, storing them in a hidden compartment within the vaults of a private law chamber near Lincoln's Inn, the very atmosphere around us seemed to shift. We had scarcely spoken of the find aloud since our return to Baker Street, yet already unseen currents stirred against us. On a morning of thick fog and distant chiming bells, a knock sounded at our door. Mrs. Hudson, whose expression bore a trace of concern, informed us that a gentleman had arrived, well-spoken, well-dressed, and not inclined to give his name. Holmes glanced at me briefly and then nodded. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson, if you please." The man who entered was tall and angular, clothed in a dark morning coat with a pearl stick-pin and gloves of fine kid leather. His features were bland in that singular way possessed by those accustomed to remaining unnoticed, and his voice, when he spoke, was the voice of Westminster committees and closed-door inquiries. "Mr. Holmes," he began, removing his gloves one finger at a time, "I trust I need not introduce myself." "You have succeeded admirably in avoiding it," Holmes replied without rising. The man allowed a thin smile. "Then allow me to speak plainly. The volumes you recently recovered, ecclesiastical in nature, some of them bearing dangerous claims, belong, by quiet agreement, to the discretion of the Crown. I have been sent to ask, politely, of course, that you relinquish them." For what reason? Holmes asked coldly. National harmony, came the reply. Such texts are apt to stir debate in circles where debate is unwelcome. Our concern is not with you, Mr. Holmes. We recognize your discretion, but others may not be so tempered. And who is to decide what is unwelcome, yourself, or the unseen body you represent? There are higher considerations than truth, the man said. Stability, for one, continuity, order. Surely even you can appreciate that. Holmes rose at last, his expression unreadable. I appreciate, he said quietly, that the suppression of knowledge often breeds the very disorder it purports to avoid. You may return to your superiors with this assurance. The manuscripts are not in my possession, nor will they be placed in yours. They are now in the care of a man of letters, one whose name you will not find in your ledgers, and whose allegiance lies not with governments, but with scholarship. The man's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Then you have chosen your side. I have, Holmes replied, and I suggest you choose your next words with care. A long pause followed, during which the man appeared to weigh something internal. Then he gave a curt bow, replaced his gloves, and turned toward the door. You may yet regret this, Mr. Holmes. I have made peace with graver matters, Holmes said, and the door shut behind their visitor with a gentle finality. Later that day, we met with Professor Edmund Verrill, an antiquarian of impeccable reputation, and a quiet friend to Holmes in several discreet cases. Verrill received the manuscripts with solemn respect, his eyes misting as he lifted the brittle covers and examined the faded script. They shall be safe, he said, locked, catalogued, and hidden from the eyes of zealots and meddlers alike. And one day, perhaps, the world will be prepared to read them. As we departed into the late afternoon mist, I turned to Holmes. You put yourself at great risk. He lit a cigarette and stared into the deepening fog. Some truths, Watson, he said, must be kept not to protect the world from them, but to protect them from the world. We walked on in silence, the mist closing behind us, and the Thames rolling steady and indifferent through the heart of London. We returned to Baker Street in the late hours of the afternoon, the air heavy with moisture, and the dim haze of chimney smoke settling over the rooftops like a veil. Mrs. Hudson had placed tea upon the sideboard, untouched, and Holmes resumed his seat by the hearth without a word. For a time, neither of us spoke. I busied myself with the fire, stirring it to life, though it scarcely needed tending. Holmes sat in still repose, his long fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed not upon me, nor the hearth, but upon the thin stream of grey light filtering through the lace curtains. Upon the mantel lay a single volume, the same weathered book Holmes had withdrawn from the Southwark vault days before. Its spine was cracked, its cover unadorned, save for the imprint of age and water. Holmes had placed it there as one might place a watch upon the table after a long journey, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder. At last, I broke the silence. Do you mean to publish them? Holmes stirred slightly, but did not turn his head. No, he said, not yet. But they contain knowledge, history. If even half of what we found is authentic. It is authentic, Holmes interrupted softly. I have cross-referenced 2 of the texts with fragmentary scrolls kept in the Bodleian and a privately held papyrus in Zurich. The handwriting matches, the materials are consistent. What we recovered is genuine. Then why not reveal them? I pressed. Holmes shifted his gaze to me. There was no frustration in his manner, only that peculiar weight he bore when confronted with something outside the bounds of his usual logic. Because truth, Watson, is not merely a matter of fact, it is a matter of reception. A word spoken too soon becomes noise, or worse, heresy. These manuscripts would not be welcomed into libraries. They would be condemned in pulpits, twisted in political halls, and perhaps used as fuel in another fire. He reached for the book and ran his fingers across its surface. "There will come a time," he said, "when England is ready for them, when men seek understanding over obedience, when questions are not punished with silence." I fell quiet, uncertain whether to challenge his view or to agree. In truth, I suspected he was right. We had, on occasion, witnessed how the public recoils from disruption, even when born of reason. The fog began to roll in again, soft and colourless, seeping across the panes as if the city itself was sighing. Holmes stood, crossed to the window, and drew aside the curtain. Outside, gas lamps flickered dimly in the distance, their glow blurred and hazy. A hansom cab passed, its driver hunched low against the damp, and the cry of a newspaper boy drifted faintly from a far-off corner. Holmes did not speak again. He remained there as I gathered the tea things and extinguished the lamp. When I glanced back at him, tall, still, his profile carved against the pale grey glass, I saw that he held the book once more in his hand, turning it slowly, as if weighing not its words, but its burden. And in that quiet, as night folded itself over Baker Street, I felt that we had uncovered not merely a hidden library, but something greater and more elusive, an unwritten truth whose hour had not yet come. And so beneath the rising fog and behind the walls of old London, another secret slips back into shadow. The case of the drowned library reminds us that not all mysteries end with applause, nor do all truths wish to be known. Sometimes knowledge waits patiently, buried, sealed, and silent, until the world is ready to listen. If you enjoy tales of forgotten histories, quiet conspiracies, and the enduring brilliance of Sherlock Holmes, we invite you to subscribe to the Drawing Room Detectives. Until our next case, thank you for joining us. May your curiosity be sharp and your path always well lit.